Information about the Taliban. The Taliban is a radical Islamist group that emerged in Afghanistan in the 1990s. Founded in 1994 under the leadership of Mullah Muhammad Omar, the Taliban seized control of most of Afghanistan in 1996, enforcing a strict Sharia regime. This period was marked by severe human rights violations, including the complete restriction of women's rights and bans on entertainment and art. In 2001, the Taliban was overthrown by a U.S.-led coalition, but continued its insurgency in rural areas. In 2021, following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Taliban regained power. Today, the Taliban faces international criticism for policies that restrict women's education and employment while enforcing strict Sharia laws. Afghanistan struggles with economic crises and humanitarian challenges, and the Taliban regime remains largely isolated on the globe. War crimes in Afghanistan. War crimes in Afghanistan span the conflict period from 1979 to the present. Beginning with the Soviet invasion in 1979, over 40 years of civil war in various forms have devastated Afghanistan. War crimes have been committed by all parties involved, though the Taliban has been responsible for the majority of them. Since the emergence of the Taliban in the 1990s, their crimes have included the unlawful killing of civilians during the rule of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, the systematic killing of civilians and sexual violence during the 2010s, and the execution of civilians during the Taliban's 2021 offensive. Other atrocities include targeted attacks on ethnic and religious minorities, such as the Hazara community, destruction of schools, and bombings of civilian areas. The Taliban has also been linked to the forced recruitment of child soldiers, torture of captives, and suppression of free speech through extrajudicial killings of journalists and activists. These acts have left a deep scar on Afghan's social fabric, perpetuating cycles of violence and fear. Massacre of civilians during Taliban's rule, 1996 to 2001. During the Taliban's military takeover of Mazar-e-Sharif on August 8, 1998, Taliban forces killed civilians, mainly Hazaras, along with some Tajiks and Uzbeks. The killings, carried out by gunfire and throat-slitting, began around 10:30 a.m. and continued until noon. These executions persisted until August 13 or 14. In May 2000 and January 2001, the Taliban carried out further massacres, primarily targeting the Hazara community. In the Robatak Pass massacre in May 2000, 31 individuals were killed by Taliban forces, 26 of whom were identified as civilians by Human Rights Watch, HRW. From January 8 to 11, 2001, Taliban forces executed 170 civilians in Yakolang through firing squads. These events were part of the Taliban's systematic targeting of ethnic and religious minorities, especially Hazaras, during their regime. Such atrocities left deep scars on Afghan society and contributed to the group's notorious human rights war crimes by Taliban insurgents, 2001 to 2021. The Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission classified the Taliban's acts of terrorism against Afghan civilians as war crimes. According to Amnesty International, the Taliban committed war crimes by targeting civilians, including killing teachers, abducting aid workers, and burning school buildings. Amnesty International reported that in 2006 alone, 756 civilians were killed due to Taliban roadside bombs or suicide attacks. These deliberate attacks on civilian infrastructure and personnel showcase the Taliban's disregard for international humanitarian law. By targeting educators and aid workers, the group aimed to destabilize communities and obstruct access to education and humanitarian aid, deepening the suffering of the Afghan people during this period. Taliban's systematic killings and human shields, 2010. In 2010, the Taliban systematically killed Afghan civilians, often accusing victims of supporting the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. A journalist interviewed by Amnesty International revealed that village elders who refused to cooperate with the Taliban were executed and posthumously accused of spying for the U.S. NATO claimed the Taliban used civilians as human shields, citing the May 2009 airstrikes in Farah province, which reportedly killed up to 150 civilians according to Afghan authorities. NATO stated it had evidence showing that the Taliban forced civilians into buildings likely to be targeted by NATO aircraft. An ISAF spokesman described it as a deliberate Taliban strategy to create a civilian casualty crisis, saying, "These were not human shields, but human victims." Additionally, the U.S. State Department noted that the Taliban violated human rights in Afghanistan, particularly against women, perpetuating widespread oppression and violence during Taliban atrocities against civilians, 2011 to 2015. In 2011, the New York Times reported that the Taliban were responsible for 75% of civilian deaths in the Afghan war. UN reports consistently attributed most civilian casualties to the Taliban and other anti-government forces. In 2013, the UN revealed that the Taliban planted bombs along transit routes, endangering countless lives. In 2015, Amnesty International documented Taliban massacres and mass rapes of Afghan civilians in Kunduz. Taliban fighters targeted women related to police commanders, soldiers, and midwives, subjecting them to murder and sexual violence. A female human rights activist described the situation. When the Taliban declared control over Kunduz, they claimed to bring law, order, and Sharia. But everything they did violated both. I don't know who can save us from this situation. In Kunduz, Taliban death squads used a list of civilians, including activists, journalists, and government workers, conducting house-to-house searches to execute them. They also killed a wounded woman in her home by shooting her in the